Okay, so this week we are talking about why change and why it's so important in the sales process. So just a reminder for anyone who's not watched any of our webinars before, Hulock Consulting helps sales professionals to improve their performance through training and coaching so that they can win more deals and generate more revenue. And my name is Tim Gibbons. I've got about 33 years in experience in industry, 25 years in sales, and I have been teaching sales for about 6 years now. So I've got a few quotes about change through the course of the presentation because I think they are quite interesting and useful additions to what I've got to say. So the first one is from George Bernard Shaw. Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. So what is change? Okay, so change is to make the form, nature, or content or future course of something different from what it is or what it would be if it was left alone. So we could have something like changing one's name. So that's a very binary thing. Today I'm called John, tomorrow I'm called Tom. We might change your opinion, or we might even, if we're very lucky, change the course of history. So that's where we've changed something from what it would be if compared to if we'd left it alone. So it's anything that sort of other words that you can use for it: transmute, transform, vary, mutate, amend, modify, etc. So lots of other words that we can use for change. So why is it important, and why is it so important in sales? So when we go to a customer and say, "Would you like to buy my product?" we are in fact asking them to make a change. They are currently running their business, and they're probably quite possibly just running their business perfectly happily without the realization that change is going to be needed. And so if we go up to them and say, "Would you like to buy my product?" they don't understand why they need it, right? So they don't understand why they need to change. And so generally just talking about your product is going to lead to failure, right? And the fact is that studies show that 60% of sales opportunities that have been defined by salespeople are actually lost to no decision rather than competitors, which means that the customers decided not to change. They haven't got them bought from another person or another company. So they've not gone to a competitor of yours. They've just decided not to do anything differently. Okay. So without that compelling case for change, the customers will tend to do nothing. And that case for change is one of two things. It's either a need to do something different, or you've got to change to avoid something that's going to be bad, right? So they need to understand the risk of doing nothing or that compelling vision of what better looks like. Otherwise, they're going to do nothing. So let's think about it in terms of the customer's buying cycle. So the customer starts in what we call the status quo position. They're perfectly happy with where they are, right? Now, as I say, that's the majority of customers for the majority of time. Over time, they may start to think, everything's not quite perfect. And they enter what's called the window of dissatisfaction. And at that point, they're starting to think, could probably do with doing something about that, but they never quite get around to doing it. But over time, as it goes on, they start to realize, actually, I do need to do something about this. I have to make a change. I've been forced into doing something different. So I'm going to go out and look for alternatives. I'm going to go and look at what else I can do that's going to remove this problem from me. And they'll go and look at a whole variety. They'll go and search the web, and they'll go and make a decision based off their research. And they'll go and implement the change, and then they're back in the status quo. They're perfectly happy with where they are. Okay. So in terms of their chances of buying from you in any of these stages, we're in the status quo, 1% chance of buying, pretty much negligible. They're not going to do anything different because they're perfectly happy with where they are. In the window of dissatisfaction, if you go up to them and say, I've got this product, it can help with your problem, and you're the first person to do that with them, there's a 75% chance that they're going to buy from you, right? That's an enormous increase, right? If you leave them to go and search for alternatives, they're going to go and look at all the competition as well. And they may not be fully informed as to what the best product is, but simply because of the fact they're looking at alternatives, the chances of them buying from you are highly reduced. You were down to 17%, right? So our best chance of buying is when they're in that window. Now, the fact is, we don't know that they're in the window because no one really advertises that, right? But that's where we have got a greatest chance of winning. Now, 50% of our customers are in the status quo, 40% are in the window, only 10% are actively buying, right? So if we rely only on those ones that are actively buying, we've got a small number of customers and a small chance of actually winning. And that's not going to give us a sustainable business. Whereas if we look at all the customers who are in the window, if we're the first to connect, A, there's a lot of customers in there, and B, we've got a great chance of them buying. But even more so, if we can push the customer out of the status quo and into that window of dissatisfaction, first of all, we know that they're in the window. And second of all, we're the first to connect with them. It doesn't matter that we've pushed them into the window. It matters that they're there and that we're there to help them. And the only reason they get pushed into the window is because they learn something new. And they learn something new that makes them unhappy with where their whole situation, and they therefore realize they've got to make a change, and they're far more likely to buy your product as a result. So that whole idea of tell the customer something that makes them want to change, that makes them unhappy with the way they're operating, gives you that greatest chance of being successful, which is why the whole point of why change is tell the customer something they don't know to make them change, and they're far more likely to buy your product. And we therefore have to start with why change, not here's my product, here's what it does for you. So Woodrow Wilson said, if you want to make enemies, try to change something. So change is difficult. We all know that change is difficult. We don't like it. We're generally averse to it, right? But the fact is, change is going on all around us, right? So this is the same scene taken on four different days in 4 different seasons. And we can see how the weather has changed. We change. So this is my evolution from the age of 8 to about the age of 45. Although I did notice afterwards that 3 of those pictures involve alcohol. So maybe some things don't change, but we change, right? But in general, we are averse to change going on around it. So why is it difficult? Okay. So McKinsey reports that 70% of change initiatives never reach their stated goals. So all those companies and all those clever people in them start to try to change, but actually never get around to being successful. And if you think about it, when did you last voluntarily change your password? When did you last change your bank account? And when did you last change your utilities provider? For most of us, we don't tend to change those things unless we're forced to. So we avoid change if we can. Okay. So why is it difficult? So that's a picture of the Luddites, which is a group in Britain, sort of a few hundred years ago, who objected to the mechanization of processes, and they went around smashing machinery because they thought it was going to take all their jobs away. Okay, but there's a variety of reasons why we think change is difficult. First of all, when motivated by negative emotions. So we tend to think that something that's bad is a good reason to change, but actually that's quite opposite. The reality is the opposite is true. Negative emotions may trigger us to think about everything that we're not doing or feel like we're doing wrong, but they're not great for making things stick. So if we just think, well, I'm not fit enough, right, that's a negative emotion, and it's not a great reason for us to actually go and starting to get fitter, right? We try to do too much. So we try to change everything about what we're doing. So we might say, I don't go to the gym at all, and I'm going to go to the gym 5 nights a week. Right. Well, that's just too big a change for you to possibly get around to doing. So we need to start by going 1 night a week. And if we embed 1 night a week into our routine, after a few months, we can then start to embed 2 nights a week into our routine. And we can do, if we change slowly, we're far more likely to be successful. we have all or nothing thinking. So we start by thinking that we need to make the change, and if we don't do it, then we've failed, and that's it. We can't do it, right? The fact is that we are probably going to fail. So we've got to accept that we may not be brilliant and successful at it to begin with, okay? We neglect the knowledge that we need, right? If we're going to go and do a job, we need the instructions as to how to do it. So if we want to go and get fitter, we need to understand what the processes are that we're going to need to do that, and how that's going to affect us, and all of those things. So we need that understanding in order to help us, right? We try to change too much. We may try to change our diet and our exercise regime and all our clothes all at the same time, right? Far too much to try to do. So we're probably going to fail. So again, we've got to try and change one thing at a time. All right, we underestimate the process. It is a hard thing to do, and we don't realize how hard it's going to be. And so obviously most people give up, and I'll talk about that process a little bit more in a minute. Right? We forget that failure is usually a given. As I say, McKinsey says that 70% of change initiatives never reach their stated goals, right? And lastly, we don't make a commitment. So we sit there and we say, oh, I want to go and get fitter, but we don't go and set a target. We don't go and say, here's why I want to go and do it. What's the reason for achieving it? How am I going to go and do it? What's my target, right? So getting fitter is not a target. Being able to run, 10 kilometers in under an hour is a good target, okay? So there's lots of reasons why it's difficult. And as I say, the emotional cycle of change should have shows us that. So if we start at the top, we've got optimism and pessimism over time, right? And when we start to change, we start with what's called uninformed optimism. We think we're going to be able to go and do this. Let's go and get this thing done. And we're really optimistic, but actually we don't understand either the process or what it is that we're doing, okay? Over time, we start to realize that it's hard, and it starts to get even harder, and we enter informed pessimism. We know how hard it is, and we're not feeling great about it. We then end up in what's called the valley of despair, which is where most people give up. They realize it's just far too hard, and they're never going to get out the other side. If we can persevere over time, we start to see differences, and we start to see the impact that the effort that we're making is having on us. And if you carry on working, if you carry on aiming for it, we end up with what's called informed optimism and successful change in the end, right? So there's a product called a Slender tone belt, which you put around yourself, and it stimulates the body with electrical sensors. And apparently it takes 6 weeks for you to notice any difference when you use this. And Slender tone did a survey, they were selling them, but not being terribly successful. And they did a survey and determined that most people gave up after 5 weeks. So they never saw, they were doing this regularly, but they never quite got out of that valley of despair, because they never got to the point where they actually saw a difference. And so Slender tone implemented a system that constantly emailed people to remind them what they were trying to achieve and such like, to actually get them through that point. So once they'd got them through the 6-7 weeks and they started to notice the difference, they would then carry on using it and recommend it to more people. But it literally, they had to go through this whole big process to get people through that, because change is difficult. Okay, so how do we change someone's mind? Okay, so this is where I'm going to ask you a question. So how do you get a child to eat broccoli?
That's difficult. Well, my daughter has problems eating vegetables.
Yeah.
But we try to introduce slowly the food to her.
Yeah.
And give like a freebie for if in case of products, but we just try to slowly put in her plate and see what she does to it until she gets accustomed to it.
Yeah. So the idea is if you give a child broccoli and they just push it away from their plate, then there's no point continuing to put the same thing in front of them every night, because you're going to get exactly the same response. So you have to sort of disguise it in some respects. So you either mush it up a lot, mix it in with things, and make it look different so that they don't realize that that's what they're eating.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So
we do that.
That's good. Okay. So the great sort of method that you can use in that instance is called the Socratic method. It's obviously named after Socrates, so the philosopher rather than the Brazilian footballer. And his whole thinking process was to make people think differently about what they were talking about. So he was trying to expose contradictions in students' thoughts and ideas to lead them to a different way of thinking, right? So it's the idea is the process that you go through is understand what it is that someone's talking about, right? So ask them to explain it fully, right? Clarify that back to them, repeat it back to them and say, here's what I think that it is that you're saying, right? Ask for evidence with them, right? So why are you saying that? What is it that you're basing your position on, right? And then start to challenge them on it. So are there any contradictions, inconsistencies, or examples that don't fit with what it is that they are working or what it is that they're thinking? And continually do that such that you eventually get them to realize that they possibly aren't believing the right things. So the sort of types of questions that you could ask in these instances: what do you mean when you say this, right? Can you provide me with more details? What assumptions are you making, right? So quite often when we believe something, there are some assumptions in there, right? Because we don't know everything. So if you start to think, well, what are those assumptions? Then you start to question potentially what it is that you've got, right? Can you provide an example that supports what you're saying? What evidence have you got for that? What alternative viewpoints could there be? How else could you look at this? And things like that. So you start to question. So instead of just saying, no, you're not correct, or I think this, or sort of going almost directly opposite to what it is that they're saying, we start to ask people questions that make them challenge what it is that they're thinking, make them think differently about what it is that they're thinking. And if we can do that, then we can start to get people to change their mind and start to think more in the way that we are hopefully wanting them to change, or wanting them to think, because we want them to think the way that we're thinking, because that's going to then get them to start to buy our products, hopefully. So just another quote: if you never change your mind, why have one? Which I think is a great one, right? So we should be open to change if we can. All right. So the science of behavior change. So how is it that we're going to ultimately get people to change, right? So to get them to change, they've got to go through these 5 stages. So first of all, pre-contemplation. You need to think differently and you need to receive some new information. If we just have exactly the same facts to go on, right, there's no reason for us to change our mind. So to begin with, we have to receive some new information that makes us think differently. Then we have to go some contemplation. We have to think, okay, what does that new information mean to me? How is it going to affect me? What am I therefore going to go and do as a result? Then you start to say, okay, I realize that I now need to change. How am I going to go and do that? Right. So I start to take action. I hopefully start to see some results. I carry on doing it. And then ultimately it becomes what's called maintenance. It's part of your normal life. And now it is just a normal part of your everyday processes. So when we're asking our customer to change, right, we've got to take them through those processes, right? So we've got to go through that pre-contemplation stage. We have to give them information that they don't already know in order to make them think differently. And then we've got to explain to them why it matters to them. What is it that they're going to see differently as a result, right? And then we can start to say, well, here's, how I can help you. You could buy my product or service or whatever it is. And then we start to implement things and everything changes. So in terms of overcoming resistance, right, we have to overcome what decision scientists call preference stability. Our belief that we don't want to make things different. Okay, so when we think about a question, we fairly quickly form an opinion as to what the answer is, and we then start to look at things based on what that opinion is. And so we start to ignore pieces of information that don't fit with that model. So if we've decided things are going to work in a certain way, then we're going to go and ignore things that don't fit with that, right? So to get around it, we have to offer that new information that makes people think differently about how they view the problem or the range of options they have to be able to solve it. But it's always going to have to be something that they don't know. Okay, so we always have to see something that we don't know. So some primary research data that's relevant to their business. So what can you learn? What do you know that you've learned, or what have you researched that you can tell a customer that they're not going to know that's relevant to them? Okay, how have your products helped solve other people's business problems, right? What results have they had? How has it improved things for them, right? What's the best practice methodology based on your area of expertise? So what have you learned? Because one of the great things about working in sales is that you get to talk to lots of different customers. And so you start to see what's working well in one place. And you can start to say, well, have you ever thought about doing this? Have you tried this sort of an approach? And that starts to make people, again, think differently. And then unconsidered needs. So unforeseen problems or challenges, something that they might not have thought about that makes them think differently, okay? And then as much as you can, customize it to their specific situation. So telling them something that's not relevant to their business or whatever is not really going to work. How can you make it relevant to what it is that they want? Okay, so in terms of, you know, businesses and such like, what are the things that make businesses want to change? So technology is one of the greatest ones, right? So the invention of I guess it was the BlackBerry was the first thing that allowed us to see our emails on a easy portable device, right? Changed the way we work. But immediately someone had one, we could all see what was going on and we could sort of work those things out. Not everybody understands what technology is available. And if you don't know what technology is available, then you can't possibly explain how that's going to help them change. So you sometimes have to introduce it to the customer before you can actually persuade them to change. But that's one of the things a business's customers' needs might change. So what is it that their customers are doing that is going to change the way that they have to work, right? And again, that's something that they ought to be seeing for themselves, but they may not, or you may have greater insight into that. Obviously, the economy constantly is out there, constantly is dictating what it is that's going on, you know, with people who have got work or not work, and what changes there. Growth opportunities, what are the opportunities out there for a business to grow? You know, if that's the case, how do they need to change as a result of that? As any business grows, they have to adapt the processes that they've got to that. You know, if you've got a business of 10 people, you're going to have a different set of processes than if you've got a business of 1,000 people, because you can't manage things in the same way. Okay. Customers come in or other companies come in to challenge the status quo. So, you know, the very fact that, you know, BlackBerry came along and introduced the products that they did changed the way we all worked, right? And we all had to adapt as a result. There's a need for greater efficiency constantly. Sometimes that's a lot, you know, because of the way the markets work, sometimes efficiency is not the most important thing, but sometimes it is, depending on how your pricing is going. Competition, what else is coming along? Who else is generating products? And one of the biggest ones is regulations. So government regulations that say you must do this or you must do that. You know, certainly in health and safety, all of those things, and finance. I remember when I worked in Landmark in Halliburton, there was a whole American process that we had to go through to, you know, demonstrate that we were a viable business, and we had to do that every quarter. We had to fill in all these forms just to demonstrate that we're a continually viable business. So again, anything that you do to help people meet regulations is great. Okay, so it's just some sort of examples as to things that you know, might make people change, or think that information that people don't know that might be relevant to them. As I say, you always need to make sure these things are relevant to the customer that you're talking to. But you know, a recent study found that given the choice between two companies which offers services or products at the same price, 82% of people would be influenced by whether one of those companies supported a charity. So if one supports a charity and one doesn't, 82% of people are likely to support the one that supports the charity. Right? That's quite a huge reason to think about those things, right? Salespeople who actively seek out and exploit referrals earn 4 to 5 times more than those who don't. Yet, 91% of customers say they'd give referrals, and only 11% of salespeople ask for them, right? So if you want to do things differently as a salesperson, ask for referrals, right? Because you're going to get much better results. Well, A, that people are going to give them, and B, people are going to give you some, you're going to earn more as a result, okay? So we can tell people something different, but that's not enough. We also have to tell them the implications of that to their business. We have to translate that change into, you're going to have to do something differently, and here's what you have to do. So you can't just leave them with telling them something new. You have to explain the implications of that information to their work and how that information might affect their business. And again, that's where your primary research comes into play, where you've gone and understood what it is your customer is doing, you're understanding what it is that this change is going to be, and you can explain that to them so that they understand either the great value that they're going to get from changing, or the nightmare that they're going to avoid by changing. So, any questions from anyone about that?
I was just thinking in there how hard it is to change. In this case, you're referring like from a customer to change for instance, a product for a software to another one, right?
Mm-hmm.
That a kind of change of mentality.
Yeah, I mean that's a classic one. So, you know, I use this piece of software to do this task today. To go and change to a different piece of software is really hard, because you've got to change, you know, a whole bunch of processes. You've got to get training. The interaction of that software with all the other processes that you do is not straightforward. So persuading somebody to change from, you know, product A to product B that basically do the same thing, that's really, really difficult. As I say, you have to try and persuade them of some other reason, some other change that's got to drive that, rather than simply, you know, product A versus product B.
Maybe services, like after sales services and support.
You know, obviously, if you're half the price of someone else, that might be a reason to change. But, you know, there's still that total cost of the change, right? So, you know, buying stuff up front or whatever it is, or, you know, the cost of training and how to use it, migrating all your data across. It's not always a straightforward thing, and cost is never really a one to do.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so just a reminder, if you want to keep track of what it is that we do, there's a newsletter. We've got our online courses on Teachable, and my book is still available from the publishers. Yes. All right, stop sharing.